Secretary, Information and Broadcasting, Shri Kumar Verma ji, my esteemed colleague in Parliament, the President of ASSOCHAM, Shri Rajkumar Dhoot ji, Shri Basu Chatterjee ji, Shri D. Ram Naidu ji, Shri D. D. Purkaista ji, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I think it would be appropriate if we would place on record our sincerest gratitude for ASSOCHAM that they've taken the initiative of organizing a conference which holistically looks at the future of various different streams of activity and as to how their convergence and divergence is really going to impact the future of the India story. Mr. Verma has sketched out the landscape of initiatives which government has taken in this direction. And as all ministers are often mandated by their staffs, I have a prepared text out here which we would take as read, and I would request ASSOCHAM to circulate it later, but I would briefly confine myself to a few issues which I think are extremely germane to this deliberation as it kicks off over the next day or two. The media industry in India should be about 150 years old. If I remember correctly, the first newspapers should have come out around the time when the First War of Independence took place, or maybe a little earlier than that. Entertainment, we are celebrating the centenary of the Indian entertainment industry or the Indian film industry, and it is extremely diverse, it's extremely pluralistic in its ethos. It's contributed greatly to enriching and broad-basing the entire literary as well as the popular ethos of this country. Telecom, as we know it, is a story which is about 2 decades old, and social media, as India has experienced it, is about 5 or 7 years old. So therefore, it's a unique convergence in terms of a time scale that we are looking at, that we are trying to sort of bring to bear elements which have developed in their own time and space over the last century and a half, and to try and extrapolate as to how in the future are they going to really work in convergence with each other, and individually as verticals, what are the different issues which need to be resolved in order to see that the synergy actually takes place. I think Mr. Dhoot struck a right note when he talked about the challenges which are facing the media. Like Mr. Dhoot, all of us have always erred on the side of the freedom of speech and expression. We've always held that Article 19 as it stands constituted is something which is inviolable to the health of Indian democracy. But I think the real challenge lies in the caveats to Article 19(1) and as to how those caveats really need to be superintended. So therefore, you can find the golden mean between the freedom of speech and expression and what constitutes legitimate and rightful restriction. And I say this, with a sense of extreme responsibility, because as things have evolved over the last 2 decades, it's not only civil society, or civil society has different connotations these days, but it is society generally which is concerned about the trajectory which has taken, but even judicial institutions have had to take cognizance, and a constitutional bench of the Supreme Court recently went into the entire issue and has in fact come out with what I call first stage restrictions, which really allow somebody who is being adversely impacted by what is colloquially called a media trial, then to access the writ courts and see that if he can get an appropriate remedy. I think it would be really worth the while of this conference to seriously ponder about the various aspects of this very important pronouncement of the Supreme Court. And the reason why I say this is because the court has been extremely careful in the manner in which they have nuanced the freedom of speech and expression with what are legitimate rights, under the entire Indian legal process. But as we go forth from this particular judgment, you may have a situation whereby demands would grow increasingly in the public space about some sort of a regulatory framework, which, if you personally ask me, is something which will be an antithesis of free media as we know it. So therefore, I think it is very, very imperative that the stakeholders in the media industry introspect and see as to how, through a process of self-introspection, through a process of self-discovery, through a process of self-regulation, are able to find that golden mean between the freedom of speech and expression and what constitutes reasonable restriction under the Indian Constitution. Similarly, the Secretary talked about digitization. And I think digitization in the Indian concept, in the Indian context, has been a complete game changer. Ideally speaking, I was a lawyer in my former avatar, and if it would have been left to me, the preferred route of doing digitization should have actually been through a social contract, because eventually this is something which is between the broadcasters, the multi-system operators, the local cable operators and the consumer at the end of it, and therefore a social contract would have been possibly the most consensual way of taking this process forward. But government in its wisdom decided that we will do it through a legal compact, and we would mandate it and we would push the pace. But in the process, I think what needs to be kept in mind as we go around building the revenue models of the broadcasting industry, the revenue models for the multi-system operators, bringing about greater amount of transparency in the whole process, that all the stakeholders in this digitization process are on board. The experience of the first phase of digitization has been extremely optimistic. We've digitized in 3 cities. In Chennai, we've had a bit of an issue with the courts, which we are trying to resolve. But the one takeaway, and I say this with a great sense of responsibility, because my constituency is among the ones which are in the second phase of digitization, that it is very important that no stakeholder in this industrial process, in this whole process, feels shortchanged. And that's a responsibility which industry will really have to take upon itself to ensure that all the stakeholders are on board, and ultimately it's really a win-win situation for everybody. When I took over as the minister on the 29th of October 2012, we had 2 days to go before the deadline of phase 1. And I was under tremendous amount of pressure that we should relax the deadline of phase 1. But we decided that we would stay the course, because I knew the pitfalls of really reneging on deadlines and the implications that it has for the whole process. So therefore, we ended up staying the course. But as we go into phase 2 and phase 3 and phase 4, I think the industry will also really need to walk that extra mile to get all their other recalcitrant, fellow travelers on board. Simultaneously, the Secretary also referred to this entire system of measuring what audiences like to watch and then extrapolating it to how advertising revenue is really shared. Well, I do not really want to get into the merits of whether a particular model is flawed or a particular model is kosher because of the lack of an alternative, but I think it would be worth the while of the broadcasting industry to really move on the Broadcasting Audience Research Council, BARC, as it is known by its colloquial short name, because I think it is a travesty that you have a broadcasting space or you have a media space in the broadcasting industry which covers about 70 crore households at the last count, and it's measured by 8,000 boxes only. And I think it's unfair to the broadcasting industry, it is unfair to the advertisers also that you have such a small sample which really determines how thousands of crores of advertising revenue is really spent. I do not understand as to why there is a kind of a hesitation within the industry to move on it, but I can assure you that if industry decides to take the first step forward, as we've walked the extra mile on digitization, and we have at great I would not say political cost, but at the cost of annoying a lot of our coalition partners also steered the course. We would do that, even in the case of the audience measurement system, provided I think the industry, does put it on the front burner. Which brings me to the third thing which I keep thinking about. You see, I have no difficulty with a free media. As I said, I'm a believer in self-regulation. I believe that, it is very vital to sustain a free democracy that we must have a free media. But I think it was also worth our while to introspect and really draw a line between a responsible discourse and a corrosive discourse. As India embarks upon the next 2 decades of its growth trajectory, and we have, and this is the space for consolidation that we have, because if the 21st century is really going to be the India century, if it is going to be a century where the Asian powers really after the 19th century are able to punch to their weight on the national stage, these next 2 decades are extremely vital as the space that we have for consolidation. And in this space, in addition to whatever the initiatives the government or other sectors of the Indian economy take in order to see that we lift people out of poverty, we are able to create employment, we are able to create more skills. It is also important that we have a honest, frank, but a responsible level of discourse. You see, one thing which we are repeatedly told is that the reason why the discourse is so sensational at times is because everybody is trying to compete for that pie which is really measured by those 8,000 boxes. But I think as we go along digitizing and creating a far more transparent infrastructure, it is important that the stakeholders of the media industry also do keep this in mind, that if the cause of sensationalism was flawed revenue models, and if there is an attempt which is being made to correct it, then there has to be a certain amount of equanimity or a certain amount of response. And I do not say this because we have 2014 in mind or we have 2019 in mind. As a country, we've gone through 1999 and 2004 and 2009. So we'll go through the democratic cycle. I think that is a non sequitur which is neither here or not there. But if you look at India's long-term interests, I think this is an important issue which needs to be flagged in a deliberation of this sort. Which then brings me to my last 2 themes. I think the Indian film industry has done a tremendous job. It's grown not because of the government, it has grown despite the government. And it needs to be really applauded for not only showcasing India's soft power, but also, more importantly, for giving avenues of creativity, avenues of entertainment, ability to provoke thought to billions and billions of people across this country. I know that within the media industry, within the film industry, there is criticism that on every such dais, while we do extend platitudes to the contribution which the film industry has really made to showcasing India's soft power, there is very little that we really do in terms of trying to help this industry in trying to resolve its issues. The reality is that, most of the tax issues which continue to befuddle the growth of this industry are really state-related. And I think that as we go into the GST regime, as we are able to surmount this federal-state divide and migrate to a goods and service tax regime, you would find that a lot of these taxation issues, would get resolved or sorted out, or would begin to get sorted out, which then, brings to us to the whole question of certification or censorship, as it was called in its earlier days, which again is a function of 19 and the caveats to 19. But what concerns me and is that if we are going to allow state governments to have an informal veto on cinematic products which are cleared by the Central Board of Film Certification or its various other committees, then we are going to have an unfortunate situation where you'll have every film producer going from secretariat to secretariat, hat in hand, begging each state government to allow his movie to be screened. And that is why when this recent controversy took place with regard to a film in Tamil Nadu, we decided that possibly the time has come to look at the entire framework of the Central Board of Film Certification Act and to see as to how do we reconcile the remits that we have under entry 60 of the 7th schedule, whereby film certification is the exclusive preserve and the exclusive jurisdiction of the central government, and see as to how it can be reconciled with the powers which state governments have. I think under entry 33 of the state list, I'm trying to talk to the top of my head, so maybe I may get a figure wrong here or there, but essentially, we have constituted a committee under Chief Justice Mudgil to see as to how these two powers which vest with the state and the central governments can be reconciled and harmonized, so that film producers are not put to this ignominy of having to then go to court or having to then knock at various political doors in order to get their films screened after they've gone through the entire certification process. We are also trying to see as to how we can streamline the certification process, make it more transparent, make it more user-friendly. So therefore, that some of the complaints which keep coming about the fact that there is a certain level of less sensitivity, those also can be addressed and those also can be alleviated. So those are the concrete initiatives that we are trying to take in the cinema field. And insofar as social media is concerned, I think social media is something which has truly and absolutely revolutionized the Indian or the global the media space. In India's context, we moved from one broadcaster in 1990 to 852 broadcasters, or 854 at the last count. And then we have about 7 to 10 crore broadcasters on new media, because each person who has the ability to disseminate his point of view, I think, is a broadcaster in his own right. So therefore, there has been a certain democratization of the information space, because earlier on, communication used to be a one-way affair. A newspaper would report. The only way that you could respond is by a letter to the editor. Then you had the broadcasting media come in, which was also again a top-down approach. But social media has, completely transformed the landscape, and has put the ability into the hands of every ordinary person to be able to put his views in the public space. Now, this obviously comes with a certain cost. And contrary to what has been at times written, has been spoken, government has no desire to regulate, control, or in any manner contain what is called the new media or the social media. I think that is something which needs to be understood in a perspective. But at the same time, I think as concerned citizens, we need to make a distinction between the right to privacy and the right to anonymity. While the right to privacy in the public space, even if you're putting your views out in the public space, is something which needs to be respected. But the abuse of that right to privacy by resorting to anonymity in order to then try and create an atmosphere which can have very serious security implications also, as we saw in the case of the migration from certain cities in South India of northeastern students, are also issues which equally need to be seriously looked at. Government, from its point of view, would obviously like to use all technology platforms which it has at its disposal, print, broadcasting, new media, or any other forms of media which may emerge, in order to put its views out in the public space. But eventually, even if there is, suppose we are going to have, and with 3G and 4G and LTE and LTE plus technologies now coming in, this entire synergy which is going to take place between telecom, entertainment, media, and then its proliferation through the social media, I think also requires a possible revisit, that whether the time has come to relook at a larger legal architecture which then focuses on this convergence, and without really getting into content issues, can at least start, or we can start talking about addressing the techno-commercial issues, the various interconnect issues, which really are a byproduct of this convergence as it comes across. So therefore, with these words, it's 11 o'clock, I'm getting late for Parliament, I'm sorry. I just wanted to speak for 5 minutes, but since you had such a thought-provoking subject, and I had some of my own personal views to articulate on this matter, I thought I would share them with you. Thank you once again for giving me this opportunity, for having me amongst yourselves, and I do hope that these views would be understood in the correct context, and we would get something in terms of concrete takeaways from the industry at the end of this deliberation process. Thank you very much.